The classic car in your grandfather's garage might have a feature engineered to kill him. Not by accident, not through negligence, but by design, approved, marketed, and sold to millions of families who trusted the badge on the hood. In the next 20 minutes, we are going to walk through 25 of these features, one at a time, and by the end of this list, you will never look at a vintage car show the same way again. Some of these features were banned within a decade, some lasted 50 years before regulators finally caught up, and some killed people so quietly, so routinely, that nobody even noticed the pattern until the body count became impossible to ignore. Stay with us, because number 14 involves a piece of chrome that impaled more people than most people realize. And number 3 is the one that changed federal law forever. Let's start at the beginning with the steering column that turned a fender bender into a funeral. Before the 1960s, steering columns were rigid steel rods running in a straight line from the wheel to the front axle. Engineers loved this design because it was simple, cheap, and precise. Nobody thought about what happened in a frontal collision until crash investigators started noticing an unsettling pattern. In a moderate speed crash, the driver's body would be thrown forward with tremendous force, and that rigid column would not bend, would not collapse, would not give an inch. It would simply drive straight into the driver's chest like a spear. Doctors had a name for it. They called it the steering column impalement, and it was one of the leading causes of driver death in frontal collisions for decades. It took a young lawyer named Ralph Nader and a book that shook the entire American auto industry before manufacturers were forced to introduce collapsible steering columns designed to crumple and absorb energy instead of transferring it directly into a human ribcage. This single change, this one piece of engineering humility, is estimated to have saved tens of thousands of lives once it became mandatory. But the steering column was just the beginning. Next, picture the dashboard of almost any car built before 1970. Hard steel, sometimes wrapped in a thin veneer of vinyl, but underneath unforgiving metal bolted directly to the frame. There was no padding requirement, no crumple zone, no give whatsoever. In a crash, passengers without seatbelts, and remember, seatbelts weren't standard equipment yet, would be thrown forward into a dashboard that behaved exactly like a wall. Faces were shattered. Skulls were fractured. Children in the front seat, which was completely normal at the time, absorbed the worst of it because their smaller bodies traveled further before impact. Regulators eventually mandated padded dashboards, but for nearly 2 decades, that unforgiving steel ledge was standing between drivers and survival, and it was losing that fight constantly. Now let's talk about seatbelts, or rather, the total absence of them. It sounds almost unbelievable today, but for most of automotive history, seatbelts were not required, not installed, and in many cases actively resisted by manufacturers who worried the presence of a belt would imply the car was dangerous. Ford tried offering seatbelts as an option in 1956, and sales suffered because customers interpreted the safety feature as an admission that their car might crash. Manufacturers learned the wrong lesson from this. Instead of building trust around safety, several doubled down on marketing raw speed and styling, leaving belts out entirely well into the 1960s. The math here is brutal and simple. Unbelted occupants in a crash become airborne inside the cabin, striking the windshield, the dashboard, each other, or being ejected through the glass entirely. It was not until federal mandates forced the issue that seatbelts became standard, and even then, it took another 2 decades of public health campaigns before people actually started wearing them. Speaking of glass, here's something that should genuinely disturb you. Early automotive windshields were made of plain, untreated glass, the same kind of glass you'd find in a window pane. In a crash, this glass didn't crack into small, dull chunks. It shattered into long, razor-sharp shards that sliced through skin, arteries, and throats with horrifying efficiency. Coroners in the early 20th century began documenting a specific and gruesome category of injury: decapitation and severe laceration caused entirely by windshield glass and low-speed collisions that should have been survivable. The industry eventually adopted laminated safety glass, glass with a plastic interlayer that holds the shards together instead of scattering them, but this transition was slow, uneven, and in some markets delayed for years after the technology existed, simply because it added cost per unit. Now, here's where the story gets stranger, because some of the deadliest features weren't hidden flaws, they were selling points. Consider the suicide door hinged at the rear instead of the front, so the door swung open against the direction of travel. Manufacturers loved these doors because they made entry and exit more graceful, and because they gave certain luxury models an unmistakable, dramatic silhouette. But physics does not care about elegance. If a suicide door came open while the car was moving, the wind would catch it and rip it open with tremendous force, sometimes tearing the door completely off its hinges, sometimes flinging the passenger out with it. The nickname wasn't a coincidence. It was a grim acknowledgement from mechanics and drivers alike that these doors had a body count. Most manufacturers phased them out by the 1960s, though a few luxury brands have controversially brought them back in recent years with modern safety engineering that the original versions never had. Let's talk about running boards, those long metal footholds stretching along the sides of pre-war automobiles. They were practical. They made getting into a tall vehicle easier. And they were also a magnet for tragedy. Children and teenagers loved riding on running boards, hanging onto the doorframe as the car moved, treating it like a built-in skateboard. Parents at the time considered this a normal, even charming behavior. Then a rider would lose their grip on a turn, or the running board itself would become slick with rain, and a body would go under the rear wheel of a 2-ton vehicle. Newspaper archives from the 1930s and 1940s are full of these stories, told in a strange, matter-of-fact tone that reveals just how normalized this danger had become. It wasn't officially banned so much as it simply vanished, as vehicle design evolved and running boards became commercially obsolete, but not before claiming an enormous, largely uncounted toll. Now, number 14, the one we promised you. The hood ornament, specifically the tall, rigid chrome hood ornaments that many luxury brands use as a signature design element, the leaping cat, the winged figure, the elegant flying lady mounted proudly on the nose of the car. These ornaments were beautiful. They were also, in a pedestrian collision, essentially a spear mounted at bumper height. When a car struck a pedestrian, and pedestrian strikes at low speed were shockingly common in the era before widespread traffic signals and crosswalks. That ornament frequently caused catastrophic penetrating injuries that a flat, smooth hood would never have caused. European regulators eventually moved decisively on this, mandating that hood ornaments either be removed entirely or be designed to collapse or detach on impact. It's part of why you almost never see a rigid, upright hood ornament on any modern vehicle. The ones you do see are spring-loaded, designed to fold flat the instant they encounter resistance, a direct engineering response to decades of preventable trauma. Chrome bumpers deserve their own entry here too, not because chrome itself is dangerous, but because of what chrome bumpers were not designed to do, which was absorb energy. Early bumpers were rigid steel bars, chromed for appearance, bolted directly and stiffly to the frame with no give whatsoever. In a low-speed collision, a modern bumper is designed to crumple, dissipating energy before it reaches the occupants or the pedestrian outside. These old chrome bumpers did the opposite. They transferred nearly all of that force directly into whatever they struck, whether that was another car's frame or a human leg. Pedestrian leg injuries from bumper strikes were so severe and so common that bumper height and design eventually became one of the most heavily regulated aspects of vehicle design worldwide. Let's move to something you've probably never even considered. The split rim wheel. Before the 1970s, many trucks and some passenger vehicles used multi-piece wheel rims assembled from separate steel rings that were clamped together around the tire. The problem was air pressure. If a mechanic assembled the rim incorrectly, or if the locking ring was even slightly worn, the wheel could explode apart during inflation with enough force to send a chunk of steel flying through the air like shrapnel. Tire shop workers were killed by these explosions with disturbing regularity, and the injuries were often fatal because the flying rim segments carried the full force of compressed air behind them. Regulators and manufacturers eventually phased these designs out in favor of single-piece rims specifically because the failure mode was so violent and so unpredictable. And speaking of things that explode, let's talk about fuel tank placement, and specifically, one case that became so infamous it changed automotive engineering forever. In certain economy cars of the 1970s, the fuel tank was positioned directly behind the rear axle, with minimal structural protection between the tank and the rear bumper. In a rear-end collision, even a moderate speed impact, the tank could rupture, and the fuel filler neck could separate from the tank entirely, creating a direct path for fuel to spray into the passenger compartment and ignite. Internal company memos later surfaced during litigation showing that engineers were aware of the risk before the car went into mass production and had calculated that a minor redesign would cost more per unit than simply paying out lawsuits from the resulting fires. That calculation, cold and purely financial, became one of the most notorious case studies in engineering ethics ever taught in business schools, and it fundamentally changed how safety recalls and product liability are handled in the auto industry to this day. Now let's slow down for a moment and talk about brakes, because brake technology in classic cars carried its own quiet, grinding death toll. Drum brakes, the standard for most vehicles before disc brakes became widespread, had a serious design limitation called brake fade. Under sustained hard use, going down a long mountain grade for example, the friction material inside the drum would heat up so much that it would lose nearly all stopping power, sometimes with almost no warning to the driver until the pedal simply sank to the floor. Truck drivers and bus operators on mountain routes were especially vulnerable, and there are entire regions with local histories full of runaway vehicle disasters caused directly by drum brake fade. Disc brakes, which dissipate heat far more efficiently, gradually became the industry standard specifically because this failure mode was so dangerous and so difficult to predict in the moment. Then, there's the matter of what those brakes were actually made of. For most of the 20th century, brake pads and linings were manufactured using asbestos, prized for its heat resistance and durability. Nobody in the general public thought twice about it. Mechanics breathed in asbestos dust every single day while grinding and replacing brake components, often without any respiratory protection whatsoever. It would take decades for the medical community to fully establish the link between asbestos exposure and mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer, and by the time regulations caught up, an entire generation of mechanics had already been unknowingly exposed to a substance now recognized as one of the most dangerous industrial materials ever used in manufacturing. While we're on invisible killers, let's talk about leaded gasoline, standard fuel for nearly every classic car you can picture, valued because it prevented engine knock and allowed for higher compression engines. It also released tetraethyl lead into the atmosphere with every single mile driven, a neurotoxin that accumulated in soil, in water, and in the bloodstreams of anyone who breathed city air regularly, especially children, whose developing brains were catastrophically vulnerable to lead exposure. Public health researchers eventually linked decades of leaded gasoline use to widespread cognitive impairment and behavioral problems across entire populations, an effect so significant that some researchers have connected the phased removal of leaded gasoline in the 1970s and 1980s to measurable declines in violent crime rates a generation later. Every classic car with a carburetor tuned for leaded fuel is, in a very real sense, a small monument to one of the largest unintentional public poisoning events in modern history. Now, back to the cabin. Because the interior of a classic car had its own catalog of hazards, consider the glove box latch, a simple metal hook mechanism that, in a frontal collision, could pop open under the force of impact and send the metal door itself swinging outward with enough force to break a passenger's knee or wrist. It sounds almost too mundane to be dangerous, but crash investigators documented this injury pattern repeatedly enough that glove box latch design eventually became subject to its own specific safety standards, requiring latches strong enough to stay closed under crash forces rather than popping open at the worst possible moment. And what about the bench seat, that wide, unified front seat with no separation between driver and passengers, standard in American cars for decades? It looked comfortable, it looked spacious, and it was, right up until a collision, at which point that lack of structure meant bodies would slide, twist, and collide with each other inside the cabin in completely unpredictable ways. There was no bucket seat to hold you in position, no bolstering to keep you from sliding sideways into the door or forward into the person next to you. Combined with the total absence of seatbelts in earlier decades, the bench seat turned every hard stop into a chaotic scramble of bodies with nothing to stop the momentum. Let's talk about something almost nobody discusses anymore. The column-mounted gear shifter combined with an unguarded ignition key positioned dangerously close to the driver's knee. In a frontal collision, the driver's body would be thrown forward and downward, and that rigid key, sometimes made of solid steel with a sharp edge, could puncture the knee or thigh with devastating force. This particular hazard was so specific and so consistently documented in crash injury reports that it became one of the required design considerations once federal safety standards began mandating interior impact zones, requiring manufacturers to model exactly what a human knee would strike in a crash and to eliminate anything rigid or sharp positioned in that impact path. Now, here's a feature that killed slowly rather than suddenly, and it might be the one that surprises you the most. The vent window, that small triangular pane at the front of the door that could be angled to catch outside air before air conditioning was standard equipment. Sounds harmless. But the mechanism holding that vent window in place was often a simple pivoting latch made of stamped metal, and in a side impact collision, that hardware could shear off and become a projectile inside the cabin, striking the driver or passenger directly in the face or eyes. It's a small, almost forgettable piece of hardware, but accident reconstruction records from the era catalog a surprising number of serious facial and eye injuries traced directly back to failed vent window latches. Let's go back outside the car for a moment, because pedestrians were dying from classic car design just as often as occupants were. Consider headlight height and glare regulation, or rather, the lack of it. Before standardized headlight aiming requirements, headlights on different vehicles pointed in wildly inconsistent directions, some blinding oncoming drivers directly, others providing almost no illumination of the road ahead whatsoever. Night driving accidents involving pedestrians and cyclists spiked dramatically in regions and eras where headlight standards were loose or unenforced, because drivers simply could not see hazards in time to react. It took internationally coordinated regulation and years of coordinated pressure from safety researchers before headlight aim and intensity became a strictly controlled and tested specification rather than a matter of individual manufacturer preference. Now for one of the strangest entries on this list, the rumble seat. If you've never heard of it, picture a fold-out bench seat built into the trunk lid of certain coues from the 1920s and 1930s, fully exposed to open air, with the passengers essentially riding in what used to be the trunk. There was no roof, no doors, and in many models no seatbelt of any kind, obviously, since seatbelts weren't standard yet. Passengers in the rumble seat were exposed to being thrown from the vehicle in even a moderate collision. And there are documented cases of riders being ejected entirely during sudden braking or a sharp turn, landing on the road behind a car that had no idea they were gone until it was far too late. The rumble seat disappeared almost entirely by the 1940s, partly due to changing tastes, but largely because its safety record was, frankly, indefensible, even by the loose standards of the era. And while we're talking about exposed seating, let's discuss the jump seat, a small fold-down seat positioned in the area between the front and rear rows in certain sedans and limousines, facing backward, with occupants sitting with their backs to the direction of travel and virtually no crash protection whatsoever. In a front-end collision, a rear-facing occupant experiences forces in ways engineers of the era simply did not understand or account for, and there was no meaningful restraint system to prevent that occupant from being thrown violently forward or sideways into unpadded metal surfaces just inches away. These seats persisted in luxury and livery vehicles far longer than safety data alone would justify, largely because they solved a practical problem: extra seating capacity, without anyone seriously grappling with the injury risk they introduced. Let's talk about tires now, because classic car tires were nothing like the tires on your car today. Bias ply construction, thin sidewalls, and tread compounds that degraded far faster in heat all combined to create a tire that could blow out with alarmingly little warning, especially at highway speeds that were becoming increasingly common as interstate systems expanded in the 1950s and 1960s. A blowout at speed, combined with the marginal steering and suspension systems of the era, frequently resulted in a complete loss of control and countless fatal single-vehicle accidents from this period. Trace back to a tire that simply gave out under conditions the manufacturer never actually tested for. Radial tire technology, and eventually federally mandated tire safety standards, dramatically reduced this risk, but not before an entire generation of drivers learned to treat highway travel as an inherent gamble. Here's another one that sounds almost absurd until you understand the physics: the freewheeling clutch mechanism used in certain economy cars to improve fuel efficiency by allowing the drivetrain to disconnect from the engine while coasting. It sounds clever, and in terms of fuel economy, it actually worked. The problem was engine braking, that natural deceleration you get when you lift off the accelerator, and the engine itself helps slow the car down. With a freewheeling clutch engaged, that engine braking effect simply vanished, meaning drivers descending a hill or approaching a stop had significantly less deceleration available than they expected, right at the moment they needed it most. Drivers accustomed to normal engine braking behavior were caught off guard repeatedly, especially in wet or downhill conditions, and the feature was eventually phased out as its real-world safety trade-offs became impossible to ignore. Now, something that will make you look twice at any classic car interior you see from now on: the ashtray and cigarette lighter, standard equipment in virtually every vehicle for most of the 20th century, mounted directly in the dashboard within easy reach of the driver. It sounds like a minor convenience feature, but the cigarette lighter itself became a genuine burn hazard. A metal coil heated to extreme temperature, mounted at a height and position where a sudden stop or minor collision could throw a driver's hand directly into it, or worse, dislodge it entirely and send a red-hot piece of metal onto the floor of the vehicle, sometimes landing on carpet or upholstery and starting a fire while the vehicle was still occupied. Insurance records from the era document a surprising number of vehicle fires traced back to this exact mechanism, either from driver error or from the lighter becoming a projectile during a crash. Let's talk about the convertible roof mechanism now, specifically the manually operated folding mechanisms used before hydraulic and electric systems became standard. These mechanisms relied on spring-loaded metal arms under significant tension, and if a latch failed or a spring gave way unexpectedly while someone had a hand or arm positioned near the mechanism, the result could be a serious crushing or laceration injury. Fingers caught between metal joints closing with tremendous force. Mechanics and owners performing their own roof adjustments were particularly at risk, and it's part of why modern convertible tops use fully enclosed, sensor-controlled hydraulic systems specifically designed to stop instantly if they encounter any resistance at all, a direct engineering response to decades of hand and finger injuries from the older mechanical designs. Now here's a feature that seems almost quaint until you understand exactly how it failed. The manual choke lever, used to enrich the fuel mixture for cold starts before automatic chokes became standard. Drivers unfamiliar with the correct technique would sometimes flood the engine, and in the process of clearing a flooded carburetor, a backfire through the intake could occur, sometimes violent enough to injure someone standing near the engine bay or crank starting the vehicle by hand in older models that still used a hand crank instead of an electric starter. Hand crank starting itself deserves its own mention here, because a poorly timed backfire during hand cranking could snap the crank handle back with enough force to break a wrist or forearm, an injury common enough among early automobile owners that it became something of a grim inside joke among mechanics of the era, right up until electric starters made the entire hazard obsolete. Let's return to the exterior of the vehicle for one final and particularly grim category: exposed mechanical components near the undercarriage and wheel wells that were completely unguarded by modern standards. Drive shafts, differential housings, and exhaust components on many classic vehicles sat with minimal or no protective shielding, creating a serious burn and entanglement hazard for anyone working underneath the vehicle. Whether that was a home mechanic doing routine maintenance, or, in tragic cases documented in period accident reports, children playing near or under a parked vehicle who came into contact with a hot exhaust manifold or a component that could catch loose clothing and cause severe injury. Modern vehicles include extensive underbody shielding specifically because these older exposed designs generated a long and painful track record of preventable injuries. So here we are. 25 features, 25 ways a piece of chrome, a latch, a lever, a seat, or an invisible chemical compound quietly reshaped automotive safety regulation forever. And here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of it. None of these features were designed with malice. Nobody at any of these companies woke up wanting to hurt their customers. These were the honest limitations of an era that simply didn't yet understand crash physics, material science, and long-term chemical exposure the way we do now. Every single regulation you take for granted today, collapsible steering columns, laminated glass, seatbelt laws, lead-free fuel, asbestos-free brake linings, exists because someone, somewhere, counted the bodies and finally asked why. And the uncomfortable question this list leaves us with is simple. What are we doing right now? In the cars we drive today, that a documentary exactly like this one will be made about 50 years from now, because if history has taught us anything, it's that the most dangerous features are never the ones we're afraid of. They're the ones we've stopped noticing entirely. If this list changed the way you'll look at a classic car show, or if you learned something here that genuinely surprised you, let us know in the comments which feature shocked you the most, because we read every single one. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, where we take the things everyone assumes they already understand and show you exactly how strange and how dangerous the true story actually was. Next week, we're diving into a different machine entirely, one that was engineered around a mistake so enormous it rewrote an entire industry's approach to human safety. Until then, drive carefully, check your mirrors twice, and be grateful for every single boring, unglamorous safety feature that modern engineers fought decades of resistance to give you.